Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another exciting episode. In today's video, we are going to explore the differences between WPF and WinUI. Now, these are two important UI frameworks in the .NET ecosystem. And if you have been building desktop applications with .NET for a while, WPF is something that you would have encountered already. But in recent years, Microsoft has been pushing newer technologies like WinUI as a part of its modern Windows development stack. So, the natural questions that developers ask is, what's the actual difference? What does the difference feel like when you are actually coding and building a project? And that's exactly what we are going to do in this video. We are going to build and compare two small projects. One will be built using WPF, representing the traditional desktop approaches that many .NET developers will already be familiar of. The other will be built using WinUI, but instead of using the standard Windows only setup, I'll be using a WinUI project powered by Uno platform. Now, the reason I choose Uno platform is because it lets us work with the WinUI model while also opening door to cross-platform development. So the same UI pattern that we'll be building on Windows machine, we could deploy it on several other platforms, be it mobile, be it an Android device, an iOS, or even on the web. So this makes it really interesting on how modern .NET UI development is evolving. So in this video, we are going to focus on a few key things. How the project setup differs between a WPF application and a WinUI project. How is UI defined in XAML in both frameworks, how controls, layout and data binding works, and what the developer experience feels like when building the same kind of UI in each of these frameworks. The goal here isn't to declare a winner, but to give you a clear, practical understanding of how these technologies differ so you can decide which one makes sense for your own project. Alright, so with this said, with this context set, let's get started with the video. Alright, so let us start a new Visual Studio instance and let's create a new project and let's make a WPF application and let's call this YT WPF app. I'm going to use .NET 10 and let the Visual Studio now scaffold the project and we'll see it. Alright, so the project has come up. The designer shall load in a few moments. So in a traditional WPF app, we would see the designer and then below that we would see the code. So this is my design. Now as and when I add more controls over here, I would see the same things coming up on the UI or on the designer also. Now this is the traditional WPF app. In the app.xaml, we don't really see anything. Of course, we can add our own resource dictionaries. And also in the app.xaml.css, we don't really see anything. We can add our own DI containers and several other things. But as of now, Visual Studio is not scaffolding anything for me. Then there is this assembly info. We can just get rid of this for now. And then there is this main window again. All right. Now let's try to create a WinUI application. Let's open a Visual Studio instance again. Let's create a new project and let's look for Uno platform. So now this is the Uno platform app template and I've already installed the Uno setup. So there is a video I've done where I am showing you how to set up the Uno platform application. I'll put the link of that video in the description. You can have a look. And then this is the Uno platform app template. And if you look at the description that they are mentioning, it says it is a template for creating an Uno platform application that targets Windows App SDK, that is WinUI, WebAssembly, Android, iOS, Mac Catalyst, and Mac OS and Linux. So out of the box, this is a WinUI project and they are calling it Uno platform. So we'll be creating this. I'm going to select this, hit next, and I'm going to call this YT Uno, or let's call it YT WinUI app. That's it, create, and I'll get this template now. I'll have to choose a framework .NET 10. Now the platforms, I could choose any of these, but for now, let's just not use Android, iOS. Let's just stick with desktop. Then comes the presentation. Let that be MVVM, markup, XAML, theme. Let those be default extensions. DI, I need the DI container. Configuration, I need the localization. HTTP, I don't want any HTTP right now. Navigation, let that be the default to regions, and logging, default again. Then features, I want the VS Code debugging and I want the toolkit, .NET Mavi embedding. If you want, you could add that. And of course, the Skia rendering. Then authentication, let that be none again. And the application name, testing, I don't want anything, CI pipeline, none. So let's hit create now. Now Visual Studio is going to scaffold this Uno platform app project for me. And once that is done, we are going to look at an entirely new Solution Explorer. Cool. So this is the Solution Explorer, how it appears. First of all, I've got this app.xaml. And if you look, there will be a few resource dictionaries that it has already added. So we get this color palette override.xaml resource dictionary added to this. And if you want, we could add more resource dictionaries. Then there is this app.xaml.cs page where there is this on launched method, and it has already added several things that we chose during the setup, during the creation over there. So it has already added those things. Okay. Now it has added logging. Okay. It has added configuration. So my app settings will already be transformed into this app config object. And then there is this use localization, then configure services, and then the navigation also has been added. Now there is this very important register routes method. But before that, there's also one more line which is essentially building my DI container, which is starting the shell. That is the builder.navigate async. And this is the line which is actually building the application for me, which is building the DI container, building the shell, and adding all the navigation features out of the box into my project. So I don't really had to do much of configuration setup. All the boilerplate code that we could think of, that has already come up. Okay. Now let's get back to our WPF app. Okay. So after we have created the bare minimum, the bare bones of the solution, we first need to add a view model, and then we have to set the data context of our view to the view model. Now, this is the first step that we would do in a desktop application, right? Now, I've got a view. Let's add a new view model to this. Let's add a class and let's call it main window view model. Okay, let that be a public class, and I'm going to use this community toolkit MVVM NuGet package so that instead of using the traditional iNotify property change interface, I could use this observable object. I'll show you. So let me add that first of all. So let's add a NuGet package, and let's go to browse. Let's look for community toolkit, and we get this community toolkit.mvvm. I'm going to install this. Okay. Now let's save all of it. Let's get back. And now if I type observable object and then import the community toolkit MVVM package, I will now get this observable object. So now my main view model is going to respond to the views changes. I could establish a binding to the properties of my view model because I'm now using this observable object. Cool. Let's get back to our view, and over here now in a traditional WPF app, there are a couple of ways where you could using which you could set up the data context. Now what I prefer is setting it in the view itself. So I'm going to say window dot data context, and then over here I'm going to say local and then main view model. So this is going to set the data context of this main window.xaml to my main view model, and if I build it, it will build just fine. Okay, so something has been wrong. Okay, I missed that angular bracket, and let's build it one more time. So it builds just fine. So my views data context is now set. Now this is how you would do in a WPF app. Let's go back to our WinUI or the Uno platform app. And over here, I don't really need to set the data context, at least for my main page. Now, this is the main page. Under presentation, we have got this main page.xaml, and then we have got the main view model.c. And my app.xaml CS has already registered or has already set the data context. And how is it actually doing it? Inside this register routes method. So when you build your shell, it is going to also register all your view models against those views. So it will set the data context then and there. Now, you don't really explicitly need to set the data context for your main view model to the main page. Of course, if you add a new view, if you add a new view model, you will have to do it here. But otherwise, the things that it has scaffolded, it has already set the data context using this register method. And then it is also setting the route inside this routes.register. Okay. So my main view model will be binded to this, and my second view model will be binded to this view over here. Cool, right? So this thing is done out of the box. So now let's look at the different types of binding that we can have in a WPF application versus what we can have in a WinUI application. So let's start with the WPF app. All right. So this is my WPF app, and I'm going to create a new models folder over here first of all. So let's add a new folder. Let's call it models, and let's add a new class called person. So let's make it a public class so that we could access it in the view model, and let's use the ID. Then let's get a first name. So instead of description, let's make this as the first name. We copy this and let's add another property called last name. Now let's also add a public integer age to this class. Cool. So this is my person class, and in my view model, I'm going to use it. I'm going to make a new property, public person, and let that be small person. Let me make it an observable property, and let's just make this class as partial class. Okay. And now let's make a constructor, and let's assign person to a new person, and let's add some values to my ID, then to name. So the last name did come, and then let's also add age to it. Cool. So I have added a person observable property. Now, because I'm using an observable object and this I have marked as an observable property, the source code generators will create this observable property with the capital P, that is the person property. So this kind of becomes a backing field, and this is the actual property that is generated by the source code generators. Okay, now that is the beauty of this community toolkit.mvvm NuGet package. And then we add a new person to this. Cool. Now I need to show this person on my main window.xaml view. Let's also add a new user control. I'm going to add a new folder. Let's call it user control. And over here, I'm going to add a new item, and I'm going to choose WPF here, then choose user control. And I'm going to call this as person control. So this has added a new user control called person control. I'm going to go into its code behind file. Let me just build it once so that we get rid of this error. And now let's add a dependency property to this user control. Okay, so now let's do a prop dp, and let this be of person type, and let's call this as person. So my dependency property is created. The backing field is the person, and then the dependency property name is person. Okay, and this is of type person control, and the property, this is the property metadata, and over here we specify the default value. So because this is of type person, which is a reference type, so let's just make the default property to be null over here. Let's save this, and now let's come to my XAML, the user control XAML over here. Let's try to display this person as a card control over here. And so in order to make this user control appear like a card, let's first add a border. Let's give this a brush of color gray, and let's make the thickness as 1. Let's also add some corner radius of 8. It should be fine. And then let's add some padding to it. Let that be 8. And the height. So let the height be binded to my actual width. Relative resource, or the relative source, let that be self. Cool. So this is the border. This is how the border will appear. And now let's add the actual contents to this person user control. So let's add a grid inside it. Let's add a row definition, and okay, so I did not really close it. Cool. So this should be good. So I've added one row to it. Let me add one more. Okay, let me just copy this and paste it here, and let's give this a height of star. So all the remaining height this is going to take. Cool. So my grid is kind of set up. Now let's add some actual values to it. So let this be a stack panel, which will be in my grid.row 0. The orientation, let that be vertical, and let's add a horizontal alignment of center. And now inside that, let's add a text block. Okay, so this is the text block, and let's add some text to it. So the text is going to be binding. So the text will be the text block for the first name. So let that be person dot first name. Now this is all dynamic or the runtime binding. So it doesn't really identifies what is person. Okay, so it says no data context is found for this person dot first name, but it is not going to break anything. It is not going to give me any compile time error. All these checks will be done at the runtime. And then mode, let that be equal to one way. Okay, now let's just give it some font size of 18. Let's make the font weight as bold, and also let's give it a horizontal alignment of left. Cool. So my first name should now come up, and we see that designer isn't really showing me anything because it is not able to identify what is person dot first name. Cool. So now let's add another text block for the last name. I'm going to copy all of it actually, and instead of first name, I'm going to give it person dot last name. Mode is this. Let's make it a little smaller, and the font weight, let's not use it. Instead, let's add some opacity to it of 0.75. Horizontal alignment left should be fine. Okay, so this stack panel will contain the name of the person, the first name and the last. Cool. Now let's also add some text block for the age property. Okay, so I think this is okay to me. I just remove this text wrapping and the margin. And over here, I'm going to use person.age. So you see, it gave me bio because it really doesn't know what is person in the compile time. So it could just auto completion, just added anything. Okay, so now let's also give it some font size and let's make it even lighter. So opacity, let that be 0.85 and the horizontal alignment of left. Cool. So I think my user control is kind of complete. Let's get back to our main window.xaml and over here, let me add a grid row definition and over here, let's add the person or first of all, let's bring the user control namespace over here. So XMLNS, let's give it an alias of UC and over here, let's just give user controls. Cool. So now let's just use that user control over here. Person control grid 0, margin is 10, data context is binding person 1. Now see, it is still not able to identify what is the actual field that I am supposed to use, even though I've given the data context to here. So if we look at my main view model, this is my property. This is the property. So I'm going to call this. And now let's add the person property, which was the dependency property that we added to our user control, that is person. And let's give it the binding to the view model person. Cool. So now the person that we have added to our view model over here, that will be binded to this dependency property of this person controls user control. Cool. So now let's try to run this and my idea is we should see the card control on that UI. Yeah. So I kind of get this. We can of course fix it. It's looking really very bad. So let's fix this. So let's just give it some height of 100 and some width of 100 again. Cool. Now let's try to run this. And yeah, this looks a little better. Also, let's go to our user control and horizontal alignment is set to center. Let's make it left. And yeah, this looks a little better. Cool. So the idea here is that WPF doesn't really recognizes any compile time bind, right? So instead of person, if I give anything else like personal, it is not really going to complain anything about this at the design time. At the compile time, it is not going to say anything. Even if I compile it, even if I build a solution, it is not going to error out anything. The personal is actually not a property anywhere in my solution, but WPF is not going to recognize it during the compile time. It is only in the build time that it will complain that personal object is not found on the view model. This actually is not a very good thing, right? So let's just make it back to person. Cool. Now we look at the UNO platform app or the WinUI project that we are trying to build using UNO platform. And over here, we'll try to see if what options do we have over there. Let's do that. So I'm going to come to my WinUI or the UNO platform app. I've got the models folder. I'm going to add a new class over here and I'm going to call this person. Let this be public again. Let me just bring all those properties from my WPF app. Okay. So I've got this and let's go back to my main view model. Over here, let me add a new property and let's make this an observable property and let's add a new folder. Let's call it user controls and let's add a new item to it and let's click UNO platform. Let's add a user control and let's give this the name of person control. Hit enter and we have got the XAML file of my user control over here. Before that, let's add the dependency property to it. So prop dp tab, let's just call it person. The property name is going to be person. And so it will register the dependency property and let's just change the default value to be null. Okay. Let's come back to my main view model where I added my person property. Let's actually add some values to my person over here. Cool. Now let's go back to my user control and let's also bring in the same controls to my person control that we added in the WPF solution. Just to make things faster, I'm going to copy all of this and I'm going to bring it here. But now I'm going to do a very specific change to the way I'm using the bindings over here. So instead of writing binding, I'm going to use something called as X bind. Now when I do this, it is going to identify that person is actually some kind of property in my data context. So let me save this. So now let me change this to X bind and this also to X bind. and let me build it once. It builds fine. And now if I change my first name to, let's say, first name 1, and then if I build it right now, it is going to complain to me that first name 1 is not present in the person class. So it says person does not contain a definition for first name 1. So it is now actually identifying, or it is doing some type checking during the compile time itself, during the design time itself. So that is the benefit, one of the benefits that we get along with WinUI. Now, don't really worry about the other explained errors that we see. Okay, so now let me bring it. Let me make it. Let me remove the one from here, and let's save it, and let me build it one more time, and it builds just fine. Cool. So now once I've done this, I can go back again to my main page.xaml, and over here let me get rid of this text box and button, and let's add a new user control namespace for my main view XML, and let's call it UC, and cool. And now inside the stack panel, let's just call our person control. Person is now binded to person, and the width is this one. Cool. Now let's just make the width as 100, and then the height is equal to 100 again. Cool. All right, so now let's try to run this and let's see what we get. So yes, we can now see the card control or the person control coming up over here on the Uno platform application, which is nothing but the WinUI app. Cool. So the idea here is that when using WinUI, we are able to use something called as Xbind over here. Now this gives us the ability to have compile time checks when establishing the binding to our model properties, which was not there in a traditional WPF application. Now let's look at another important reference, which is how do we set up multi-bindings to a control. So if we look at this person user control in my WPF application, I've got one text block which is binded to this person.firstname. Then there is another text block which is binded to another property which is the person.lastname. What if I wanted to bind both of them to the single text block? Now we could use a multi-value converter over here. So let's try to add a multi-value converter to my WPF application. So I'm going to add a new folder over here, and let's call it converters. And to this, I'm going to add a new class, and I'm going to call it name multi-value converter. So this class is going to come from I multi-value converter. Let's implement the class. Let's implement the interface. Let's make it public first of all. And then over here, this will, now when this converter is used, this object array will contain multiple properties which I'm going to read over here. So my first name will be the first item in this values object. Then my last name is going to be my second item in this values array. And then I'm going to return first name plus last name with a space in between. Cool. So ideally converters are used to change the data type. But for this very case, let's just add the first name and the last name and give it back. So now let's go back to my person user control, and over here, let me first of all add the namespace to my converters. Yeah. And now let's add a window. Let's add a user control resource. And over here, let me add the converter multi-value, and let's give it a key of multi-value converter. Okay. And now over here where I'm binding my first name to this text block, I'm going to remove this text property over here and add an explicit close tag. And then inside that, I'm going to use the text block text property. And then I'm going to use the multi-binding over here this way. So now inside the multi-binding, I'm going to use my name multi-value converter. Okay, so something has gone wrong. Let me close this tag, and yeah. So I'm going to use this multi-binding tag, which is going to use this converter and then give it both first name and the last name. Okay, and now I'm going to remove this text block for the last name. Cool. Now let's run this and let us see that if my multi-value converters are actually working or not. So yes, it is now working, and this is how I could establish a multi-binding to any of my controls text property, or for that matter, this is how multiple properties could be binded to a control. Now let's try to achieve the same thing on the WinUI application or the Uno platform application in our case. So let's go back to our WinUI application. And so in our WinUI application, we don't really have a multi-value converter. So even if I try to create one, let me just add a converter. Let me just add a class over here. Add new item, C sharp general. Let's just look for class and let me call it name multi-value converter. And now if I try to bring in my multi-value converter, you will see that we are not really getting that. But if I try to add a I converter or I value converter, I do get that, right? But I don't really get a I multi-value converter. So in WinUI applications, you cannot have a multi-value converter. So how do we actually give multiple bindings to a particular control? Well, that is still possible. Let me first of all delete this. So now in order to add a multi-binding to one of my controls in a WinUI application, what I'll do is, one of the ways is, I'll go back, I'll go to my view behind or the code behind as you said, and then inside that, I'm going to add a function, public string format name, and over here, I'm going to pass both those values, first name, string, last name. And then inside this, I'm going to do my logic and return whatever I want to do along with these two names. So if you want to convert it to some other data type, you would add that logic inside a function over here. And then we are going to see how we can call this function on the view. So over here, I'm just going to use some string interpolation and add the first name, add some space, and then the last name. Now, on my UI, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this person first name, and over here I'm going to call that method format name. We copy the name over here, and then I'm going to pass in my person dot first name and person dot last name. Okay, and then I'm going to get rid of this other text block. And now if I run this, it should work just fine. It should use the first name and the last name, pass it to the format name function, and then show the values, the formatted value on the UI. Let's see this. And yes, so we see the card coming up on the UI. Cool. So this is how you would do a multi-binding in a WinUI application. Okay, so now let's try to add a style trigger to a WPF application and then see how we can add a trigger like behavior in a WinUI app. So in WPF app, let's say if I want to turn this border's background, the card's background, to some other color when I hover on the card, how would I do it? I would use a style trigger and then do it inside that trigger, right? So let's add a new style to it. I'm going to say border dot style, and then inside that I'm going to add a style whose target type is going to be border. And then now I'm going to add a trigger. I'm going to use the trigger here, and the property, let that be is mouse over is true. Then I want the background to turn to yellow, and let me move this. Now adding a style trigger to a WPF application was pretty straightforward. Then I also need to end this trigger over here. Cool. So now this was pretty straightforward. Let's just run this. And now if I run this, you see that the property is changing to yellow. Okay, I need to add a default background to it so that when it comes back, let's just make this white. And now let's try to run this again. So now you see that as soon as I bring my mouse, or if I do a mouse over action on this card, it turns to yellow and then it comes back to white, and then I bring it back, it turns to yellow again. So this was a pretty straightforward implementation in a WPF application. Just add a style trigger and you are good. But then how do we do this in a WinUI application? So now let's come to our WinUI package, or sorry, the WinUI application. And in order to achieve that trigger-like behavior, we need first of all to add a few NuGet packages to our project. So let's go to this manage NuGet packages and let's browse here. And the first package that we need is the uno.microsoft.xaml behaviors interactivity WinUI. Now, if you are not working with Uno, you can just remove Uno dot and just put in the remaining part of this package name and you will find the package. I'm going to install this and looks like it has installed it. The other package is the uno.microsoft XAML behaviors WinUI managed. I'm going to install this. So in order to get a WPF declarative kind of syntax, behaviors is another thing that WinUI has brought in. So we are going to use that. Now let me close this. Both of them are installed. Let me close this. And now let us first of all bring those NuGet packages into our view. So let's add a new namespace. Let's call it Interactivity. And we get now from that Uno package, we are actually using this Microsoft XAML Interactivity. And then we need to add that other package. Let's call it core. And then that will be XAML interactions core. Okay, so I'm so sorry. I have to add this to my person control over here. So let me add this here. Cool. Now, once we have done this, we'll have to add those interactions now. Interactivity.interaction.behaviors. And then the first trigger behavior is going to be pointer entered. Now, you'll have to be careful with the names over here. I'll tell you how we can actually get the exact name of this event. And we don't really need a invoke command action. What else we need is a change property action. Let's remove this command over here. And instead, let's bring in a target object, which is going to be binding. Okay, one more thing, we need to add all of this inside my border, right? So I'm going to bring this inside the border. Let me add one more enter to it. And first of all, let's me also end the interactivity behaviors. Now, I need to bind this to my border. Now, let's name this border first of all, and let's call this card border. And now over here, instead of binding, let's see if we could use xbind and then xbind it to my card border. Okay, then next thing we would need is a property name, which is going to be the background property for us, because we are going to change that. And then we would also need the value of this to change to yellow. So now as soon as this event happens, that is the pointer enter event, this action will take place on this event. So this is the target for this action, the property that has to be changed, and the value for the new, and the new value for that property. Cool. Now we also need a similar event that when my pointer exits it, what shall happen? So I'll just change the event name over here to be pointer exited. So it is all past tense. This is going to remain same, the target object, background again, and let's just make this white. So now with these many changes, I think it should work, and let's build it once. So it builds fine. Now let us run this and let's see if it is actually working. Okay, so the design interface has come up. Let's go to this interactive, and yes, now when I bring the mouse or bring the pointer inside it, it works. It changes the color, and when I bring it back, it reverts back to white. That is the pointer exit event has happened. Now, how do we figure out the different event names? So you go to the design interface if you are using Uno, click on the main page, edit it, and now when you are inside this person user control, you can come to all, search for pointer, and over here you will get all your pointer entered, pointer exited, all these kind of events you will be able to see over here, or they call it as interactions. Cool. So this is how you will actually implement a trigger behavior in a WinUI application. So this was a quick side-by-side look at WPF and WinUI. And as you can see, both these frameworks share some familiar concepts like XAML, data binding, and MVVM, which makes the transition between them fairly approachable for .NET developers. But at the same time, there are some very clear differences in how certain things are implemented. In WPF, many UI behaviors are implemented directly inside the XAML using triggers, multi-bindings, and converters, whereas in WinUI, those same ideas often move towards visual states, compiled bindings, or behaviors, and sometimes even a bit code behind. This kind of shift reflects the broader goal of WinUI, building modern UI applications that fit into newer Windows ecosystem and can also extend beyond it. So if you are currently working with WPF, the key takeaway is that WinUI isn't completely different. It's more like an evolution of the XAML-based UI model with some newer patterns and tooling around it. If you find this comparison helpful, consider subscribing to the channel, because I'll be doing more videos exploring WinUI, Uno platform, and the modern desktop application development stack. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.